Hello, and welcome back to American History. This week we're looking at Reconstruction, aka the time of rebuilding the nation after the Civil War. So here's your timeline of events. We're looking from 1865 to about 1877, where Reconstruction efforts kind of end. So we've got a period of about 12 years that we're looking at. So in the months after the Civil War, the nation began to rebuild and reunite. Almost immediately, fierce struggles began over how long it should take to restore the southern states to the Union and how punitive Reconstruction should be. So there was a lot of argument over whether or not the southern states who had been in rebellion previously should just get to rejoin the United States without any kind of consequence, or what sort of terms or conditions they should be subjected to be able to rejoin the Union. So in 1865, the Confederacy lay in ruins, and the South's economy was in a state of collapse as well. You have to keep in mind they're the losers of the war, and so they have experienced a lot of heartache, a lot of devastation. Everything in the South has been destroyed as far as like transportation. You got to think about the railroads that have been destroyed. You got to think about a lot of their buildings, their territories. The land value in the South decreases. Confederate money is worthless. Remember, they just kept printing money, and it didn't have any kind of like gold value or any kind of silver value to back the money, and so their money's worthless. Their transportation system is ruined, and their agricultural system is in chaos because they've never had to function without slave labor. So now they're looking at, what are we going to do to run our plantations without slaves? So the president and Congress were faced with the difficult task of reconstruction or rebuilding after the war. We had to determine what Confederate states were going to have to agree to in order to rejoin the Union. So in December of 1863, Lincoln offered amnesty or pardon to all Southerners who took an oath of loyalty to the U.S. and would accept the Union's proclamations concerning slavery. He also says, if you can't rejoin, we're going to end slavery in your territories. Nobody wants to try to take an oath of loyalty. Nobody wants to back down in the South. They still want to keep fighting for slavery. And so as a result, slavery is basically outlawed all across the country to make the Civil War, or make the losses of the Civil War, the losses of lives, more worth losing. 10% of the state's voters were required to take an oath to organize a new state government. So if you wanted to be considered a part of the Union, you had to take an oath of allegiance to be a part of that state government, or to actually have a state government. This excluded officials of former Confederate government, officers of the Confederate Army, formal federal judges, Congress members, and military officers who left their posts to help the Confederacy. So basically, if you were a part of the Confederate military government or any of that, you were not included in taking this oath, and you were not able to really be a part of the new state government after you rejoined the Union. So we're going to look at a couple of different groups. We've got the radical Republicans, which, the Republicans are the ones who helped end slavery. Lincoln himself was the Republican in the Civil War. And we're going to take a look at kind of like the way the radical Republicans saw Reconstruction, how Reconstruction needed to be. So they're led by Representative Thaddeus Stevens of Pennsylvania and Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts. So they resist Lincoln's plan, and they want to revolutionize Southern institutions, habits, and manners. Their main goals are to prevent leaders of the Confederacy from returning to power after war, become a powerful institution in the South, and for the federal government to help African Americans achieve political equality by guaranteeing their right to vote in the South. So what they're asking for isn't really too much. They don't want leaders of the Confederacy, traitors essentially. They've committed treason to return to power. They don't want the Democrats to have any kind of authority in the South, and they also want African Americans to be able to vote. obviously you want African Americans to vote if you're a radical Republican, because African Americans are going to support the Republicans. So if they vote, they're going to vote for Republicans. They're not going to vote for Democrats who wanted to keep them as slaves. So the moderate Republicans believed Lincoln was too lenient, but the moderate Republicans believed that Lincoln was too lenient, but the radicals were going a little too far in supporting African Americans. In summer of 1864, moderates and radicals agreed to the alternative Wade-Davis bill. So this is kind of like a compromise. Where did compromises get us last time? So the Wade-Davis bill required the majority of the adult white males in former Confederate states to take an oath of allegiance to the Union to create a new state government. Each state's convention would have to abolish slavery, reject all debts the state had acquired as part of the Confederacy, and deprive former Confederate government officials and military officers the right to vote or hold office. They did not include African Americans having the right to vote in the South, or necessarily having like a lot of power in the South. So Congress passed the bill, but Lincoln blocked it with a pocket veto. He feared imposing a harsh peace and requiring the majority of males to take this oath of allegiance would be counterproductive, and he didn't want to prosecute members of the South for trying to become a part of the Union again. He basically is just trying to keep the peace again. He doesn't want any more tensions to build. So the Freedmen's Bureau was developed after thousands of African Americans followed Sherman and his troops as they marched through Georgia and South Carolina to get food and shelter. To help the freedmen feed themselves, Sherman reserved all abandoned plantation land within 30 miles of the coast from Charleston to Jacksonville, Florida, for the use of freed African Americans. So basically, he just says, you know what, like, these men need a place to stay, these families need a place to stay. They need to be able to feed themselves and take care of themselves. We need to set them up here. So the Freedmen's Bureau was established by Congress to feed and clothe the war refugees using surplus Army supplies. Beginning September 1865, the Bureau provided 30,000 rations a day for the next year to prevent mass starvation in the South. Because after all, a lot of the plantations and fields and stuff had been burned by Sherman and his men and destroyed. And you also have a lack of plantations, a lack of food production, because we don't have slavery anymore. And a lot of people have, died off in the war. So maybe some of these plantation owners who, produced a lot of food, maybe they fought in the war and they died, or maybe they had to, go somewhere else. So it helped freedmen find work and negotiate labor contracts for freedmen as well. It also provided buildings for schools. They paid teachers from the North to come to the South to give these African Americans an education, and it helped establish colleges for African American teachers as well. Andrew Johnson takes office after Lincoln's assassination. So he's Lincoln's vice president, and obviously since he's assassinated, Andrew Johnson has to become president. So Johnson offers to pardon all former citizens of the Confederacy who took an oath of loyalty to the Union and to return their property worth more than $20,000. So basically, I'll pardon you if you take an oath of loyalty, and I'll give you your property back if it's worth more than $20,000. He then issues a proclamation from North Carolina as a model of how he wanted to restore the rest of the South to the Union. He says each former Confederate state should call a constitutional convention to revoke its ordinance of secession. They need to ratify the 13th Amendment, and they need to reject all Civil War debts. Former Confederate states, for the most part, met Johnson's conditions, but many Southern voters elected former Confederate officers and political leaders to Congress. So Republicans voted to reject the new Southern members of Congress, but that doesn't work out. They still have some of these, Confederate officers who get to become a part of Congress. So these people who were once like treasonous traitors decide to run for Congress as a Republican, or not as a Republican, as a representative or as a senator, and they are allowed to do so. Like, no one stops them. Andrew Johnson's just like, whatever, like he's from Tennessee, Kentucky, somewhere in the South himself. He's just kind of like, like we're done with this. Like, let's just wash our hands of it. Just let them do whatever they're doing. We just need to all get along, guys. So he basically just like flushes out Lincoln's ideas, the moderate Republicans' ideas, and the radical Republicans' ideas, and just kind of does his own thing. So black codes are really unfortunate for free African Americans. Basically, a lot of the new Southern state legislators passed these black codes, which were just laws to limit African Americans' rights. Even though they were free and they weren't slaves anymore, there were still laws that prevented African Americans from having or leading a normal life. So black codes varied from state to state. They all intended to keep African Americans in a condition similar to slavery. So even though it wasn't slavery, there are laws that basically keep African Americans from having the same rights as white Americans. So African Americans were required to enter into annual labor contracts. So instead of slavery, you get a labor contract now. Like we'll just get this contract going and everything will be fine. What sucks is they're never able to really make enough money to find another job elsewhere. Children were to accept apprenticeships in some states and could be whipped or beaten while serving those apprenticeships. It also set specific work hours for African Americans and required licenses to work non-agricultural jobs. So that obviously makes it difficult to do anything except for enter into these annual labor contracts where you're working on plantations, just like you have before. And you're not getting paid very good. Like you probably need somewhere to live. And so a lot of times these people would end up living on the plantations and owe their plantation owners money after a hard day's work to pay for rent. And so it was really just a messed up system. So in late 1865, House and Senate Republicans created a joint committee on Reconstruction to develop their own program for rebuilding the Union, and Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866 to override black codes. So that gave citizenship to all people born in the U.S. except Native Americans. Kind of strange that Native Americans are left out when they've been here the longest, but hey, whatever. It also allowed African Americans to own property and stated that they were to be treated equally in court because they are people and they are free. It also gave federal government power to sue people who violated those rights. So that's all fine and dandy. Not only is the Civil Rights Act of 1866 passed to override black codes, but we also get the 14th Amendment. So this grants citizenship to all people born or naturalized in the U.S. and declared that no state could deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. No state can deny any person equal protection of the laws. So everyone is to be treated equally. You can't make up laws like black codes to take away the rights of African Americans. President Johnson attacked the amendment and hoped voters would reject the radical Republicans and elected a new majority in Congress to support his plan for Reconstruction instead. So Johnson's not really for giving African Americans rights in this sense. He just wants everybody to be chill, like take it easy. Let's not do all this. Let's not try too hard to help these African Americans. So as far as military reconstruction, in March 1867, congressional Republicans passed the Military Reconstruction Act, and that divided the former Confederacy, except for Tennessee, into 5 military districts with a Union general in charge of each district. So now you're basically putting your South under military rule. New state constitutions had to give the right to vote to all male citizens regardless of race. Each state had to ratify the 14th Amendment before it would be allowed to elect members of Congress. And military officers supervised voter registration, and that's so that those African Americans would not be prevented from voting. Because what they would do is they would even say, yeah, you can't vote, you got to pay this poll tax. Or, sorry, you can't vote, you can't read, like whatever, like you have to pass this test. If you can't pass this test, then you can't vote. But if you have military officers there making sure that people are able to vote, things usually work out a little better for the African Americans. So by the end of 1868, North Carolina, South Carolina, Florida, Alabama, Louisiana, and Arkansas had met all the requirements, and they were readmitted to the Union. So Johnson is impeached pretty quickly after. He does this Command of the Army Act, which required all orders from the president to go through the headquarters of the general of the Army. Republicans had known that they had General Grant's support, and so if the basically, it's basically just saying like the president has more authority than General Grant. He's overstepping the general of the army and basically saying that his say is final. You also have the Tenure of Office Act, which required the Senate to approve the removal of any government official whose appointment had required Senate's consent. So Republicans had known that Secretary of War Edwin Stanton agreed with their program and would support them, and so they were cool with that. President Johnson, to get back at the Republicans, fires Stanton, which is weird because like Johnson's clearly a Republican. He ran with Abraham Lincoln. He helped alongside Abraham Lincoln. But he gets tired of the Republicans, and like because the Republicans had basically said, you know what, we've got grant support, all the orders from the president have to go through the military or the army. Now, if you want to remove a government official, for the Senate to approve the removal of any government official whose appointment had required Senate's consent, you can't just get rid of people. You can't, replace people on your own. And so basically, Johnson says, screw that. I'll fire him if I want to. And so he fires Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. The House of Representatives then voted to impeach Johnson because he had broken the law by refusing to uphold the Tenure of Office Act. And the Senate voted 35-19 that Johnson was guilty. He's one vote short of conviction. So he is impeached, but he's not convicted. Johnson finished out his presidency quietly and did not run for re-election. So he did get to continue to be president because he wasn't guilty. They didn't kick him out of office or anything. They just impeach him and say that you are not following our orders. You're not following our laws. So after Johnson finishes out his presidency, he's backed off a little bit because he knows that he's made all of Congress mad. Ulysses S. Grant becomes the next president. And we know Grant to be a great general, but he's not as great of a president necessarily. And we'll get to that in a second. So the 15th Amendment basically declares that the right to vote will not be denied on the account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So everyone will have the right to vote. Not everyone necessarily, but all men should have the right to vote according to this. Radical Reconstruction had a dramatic impact on Southern politics. A lot of these African Americans were able to be a part of the political process for the very first time. And since Southern society starts to change, so you have more African Americans voting in the South, and as a result, you have more Republicans in office. Now you have a Republican-dominated South. So under Republican rule, as Reconstruction begins, many Northerners moved to the South because they wanted to help, they wanted to make sure that Southerners, racist Southerners, were not able to interfere with the progress that was coming or the changes that were being made. Southerners started referring to the newcomers, the Northerners, as carpetbaggers because some arrived with suitcases made of carpet fabric. They basically look at them as scumbags because they're trying to take advantage of a war-torn region. They're just looking for more opportunities, and basically they're just going to help these whites and African Americans, educate them and whatnot. So the Southerners don't really care for these carpetbaggers, as they call them. They also disliked other Southerners who supported Reconstruction because that's basically treasonous to the South. They referred to those Southerners as scalawags. They're those scalawags supporting those Republicans and giving African Americans rights whenever they should still be slaves and whatnot. And so a lot of these people are former Whigs, the Southerners who were supporting Republicans and supporting Reconstruction. A lot of them own small farms, and so they're benefiting from Republican rule. And some of them are just plain old business people. And they want to see the economy start to thrive instead of, because they hadn't made any money before. The only people who really made money in the South were those plantation owners. And so now they're wanting to see some changes made as well. They're like, you know what? It's time to spread the wealth evenly. It's time to give everybody an opportunity. So as far as African Americans in politics, the 15th Amendment allowed for many educated African American leaders to serve in nearly all levels of government. You had a lot who served as delegates to state constitutional conventions, a lot who won election local offices from mayor to police chief to school commissioners. You had dozens who served in Southern state legislatures. You even had 14 who were elected to the U.S. House of Representatives and 2 who were elected to the U.S. Senate. So this is the first time in our history that we have African Americans take part in politics. Poor white farmers and African American voters created a more Southern Republican dominance over former Southern planters. Obviously, they're going to vote for Republicans because Republicans support them. They make laws that support poor white farmers and African Americans. They repealed black codes. They made more state offices elective. They established state hospitals and institutions for orphans, the mentally ill, and hearing and visually impaired. They rebuilt roadways, railways. and industries in the South, and they helped establish a system of public schools. They also created reforms that were paid for with higher property taxes, causing many property owners to lose their land. That's particularly unfortunate to the plantation owners who have lots of property and they have to pay more tax on those things. A lot of Republicans wanted to help, but others were corrupt and would start accepting bribes also. So we do have a lot of good things coming from the Republicans, but there are some Republicans who are just looking for power. And that comes a lot of the time with politics. You have some people who want to make a difference, and then you have some people who are willing to take bribes, and they become corrupt and accept bribes, and they stop looking out for the betterment of the nation and they start looking out for themselves. So in African American communities themselves, churches were like the center of African American communities. They, were the place where schooling took place. They hosted social events. They had political gatherings. You had your Freedmen's Bureau that established schools for African Americans in the first years of Reconstruction. And then by 1870, you had 4,000 schools and 9,000 teachers who taught 200,000 formerly enslaved people of all ages. Reconstruction governments built comprehensive public school systems, leading to 40% of all African American children attending school. While that's less than half, that's still quite a few more that attended school during, before the Civil War, during the antebellum period. So African American academies grew into a network of African American colleges and universities. Thousands of other support organizations established, ranging from burial societies and debating clubs to drama societies and trade associations. Now, the Ku Klux Klan, or the KKK, is it's one of these groups that basically despised Republican government. They didn't like the idea of Republicans taking over and taking power away from large plantation owners, and they didn't like the idea of African Americans having rights necessarily, especially being able to vote and take part in politics, because that's what took away power from the Democrats. So the Ku Klux Klan was the largest of these groups, and it had begun in 1866 by former Confederate soldiers in Pulaski, Tennessee. The goal was to drive out the carpetbaggers and the Union troops and regain control of the South for the Democratic Party. And so what they would do is they would hood up, put white robes on, and ride together at night and terrorize supporters of the Republican governments. They would break up Republican meetings. They would drive Freedmen's Bureau officials out of their communities, burn African American homes, schools, and churches. And they tried to keep African Americans and white Republicans from being able to vote because they wanted Democrats to regain their authority in the South. So they're very terroristic, very threatening. A lot of people experience a lot of devastation under the Ku Klux Klan. So some Republicans and African Americans formed their own militia groups and they fought back. The Republicans in the South even petitioned Congress in 1871, and they say, "We believe you're not familiar with the description of Ku Klux Klans riding nightly over the country, going from county to county, and in the county towns, spreading terror wherever they go by robbing, whipping, ravishing, and killing our people without provocation, compelling colored people to break the ice and bathe in the chilly waters of the Kentucky River. We pray you will take some steps to remedy these evils." Even though this was going on and several people are being terrorized and threatened and killed, Congress just passes some acts to help stop the KKK. They're it's a federal crime to interfere with citizens' right to vote. Federal elections are under the supervision of federal marshals, and the KKK Act outlawed the activities of the Klan. But, it's one thing to make some enforcement acts, and it's one thing to actually enforce them. And so eventually they all come to an end. Now, Reconstruction collapses after President Grant becomes president. And honestly, it's not necessarily because he's a bad person or he didn't care. He just didn't have experience in politics. He was a great general, but he didn't really understand the role of president, and he didn't fit what the president's role needed at that time. So he believed the president's role was to carry out the laws and leave development to Congress. He didn't want to help create laws. He didn't want to push in one direction or another. And so this creates a divide in the Republican Party. And the Republicans are the ones who are basically driving all of the Reconstruction Acts. And it undermines public support for Reconstruction as well, because a lot of people who are, working on Reconstruction, and then Grant comes up and he's president and he just doesn't really say much about it. A lot of people just kind of back out. They're like, maybe we need to chill out. Maybe we don't need to do this so much. So in 1873, you have bad railroad investments that forced the powerful banking firm of J. Cook and Company to declare bankruptcy. So this is the panic of 1873. A bunch of other smaller banks close as well, and the stock market plummets. Thousands of businesses have to shut down, and unemployment soars as a result. So not only have we just gone through this major civil war, but now we have a lot of banks that have closed down, the stock market's down, and a lot of people are losing their jobs. So you have a lot of people in really tough positions towards the end of Reconstruction. Political scandals in the Panic of 1873 led to a shift of power from the Republicans back to the Democrats in Congress. More Northerners were concerned with their own economic problems rather than the South's. And so they, obviously have to stop and kind of focus on themselves. They're like, our banks are shutting down. A lot of people are losing jobs in the North. We need to kind of let the South do their own thing and back out. Democrats gained state and local government control in the South through terrorist groups like the KKK. They helped those terrorist groups intimidate African Americans and white Republican voters, and resorted to various other forms of election fraud, as well as appealing to white racism by defining elections as a struggle between whites and African Americans. So the Compromise of 1877 says, Republicans were going to nominate Rutherford B. Hayes. Many Americans regarded Hayes as a moral man, untainted by scandal. Hayes wanted to end radical Reconstruction. The Democrats nominated Samuel Tilden. So on Election Day, Tilden wins 184 electoral votes and Hayes wins 165 electoral votes. 19 out of 20 votes were in dispute due to election fraud in Louisiana, South Carolina, and Florida. People were concerned about the fact that Democrats are going to keep Republicans and, Southern white Republicans and African Americans from voting. So Congress appointing a 15-person commission made up equally of members of the House, the Senate, and the Supreme Court. You have 8 Republicans and 7 Democrats. What do you know? More Republicans than Democrats. So who do you think gets the votes? Hayes, because he's the Republican. They reported there was supposedly a promise by the Republicans to pull federal troops out of the South if they elected Hayes as president. And that's exactly what happened. So, we don't know necessarily that bribe actually happened, but it makes sense because that's what ends up happening in real life. So the New South was a phrase coined by Henry W. Grady, which was the New South goal was to develop a strong industrial economy. So by 1890, almost 40,000 miles of track crisscrossed the South, where most of it had been destroyed. Industry in the South grew. They were now producing, had iron plants, steel plants, tobacco processing, cotton mills. They had moved away from plantations and moved into more industry. Many African Americans had returned to plantations owned by whites to do work for wages, or as tenant farmers, where they, they basically worked to live there. Most of those tenant farmers, like I said, they become sharecroppers, which leads to debt peonage because many of them are unable to make enough money to pay off their debts and leave, nor could they declare bankruptcy, which led to imprisonment or forced labor. So they're back into conditions very similar to slavery. This is it for this chapter. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. Let me know. You guys have a lovely rest of your day. Hope you have a good week. Let me know if you need anything.